Okay. We are live. All right, the time is 5:04. This is going to be a work session for the town of Silverton. I'm going to talk through our memo and we'll have a bit of conversation, discussion, and presentation with our consultant from Ironwood Consulting. Right, go ahead, staff, take it away.
Great, thanks. I do want to note the date. It is August 26th and it is 5:04.
Oh yeah, and we are waiting. Tyler George should be here and Jim Harper should be here in a bit. Otherwise, the rest of the trustees are present.
Perfect. And for staff, you have Gloria Koshberger and Lucy Mulvihill. So we'll just start with giving you an overview until Ironwood gets online. And kind of talk through that. One thing I didn't tell you guys in here in the budget was that we haven't expended the 26,000 for the project, even though I was assured that there would be invoiced to us this week. My goal, well, how we had budgeted last time was that 13,000 would be spent last year, and that was not spent last year. So that's going to be spent this year to do the full project of the 26th, which is the reduced project technically. So I just wanted to let you guys know that price tag and that work has already been completed. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll just start by providing a little bit of history on this conversation, since all of our trustees were not present from the beginning. In 2023, the town approved a plan to expend a little over $63,000 to rehabilitate public and private land, consisting of a fen and essentially wetlands, a wetlands project with CDOT and some local landowners in town.
And where we're at in that process is we are finalizing the draft contract with CDOT and the private landowners. And things move at a snail's pace with CDOT. So I hope to have that contract signed this year, but considering I've been waiting a year and a half for it, I don't have my hopes up.
And again, just clarification, the holdup is with CDOT, not with the town or the private landowners. We are ready to go.
Yep, we are ready to go. Just trying to navigate the state's processes for contracting.
Great. And then following that, we received a few land use applications where the topic of wetlands came up. And that was following a Supreme Court decision that essentially reduced the amount of wetlands in this country under the jurisdiction of the Federal Army Corps of Engineers. And so kind of those two things prompted community conversation around creating a local wetland policy or regulation. And so the town board took action and we released an RFP for a consultant to provide us some more information about our local wetlands. And in 2023, Ironwood was selected. And then the memo outlines kind of the project scope and the project goals, which Ironwood will go into shortly. So I won't repeat that, but they essentially mapped out our local wetlands in town and provided us some information. And that map was presented to the Board of Trustees in November of 2023. And then following that, we had many conversations about whether or not to move forward with wetland regulations. And eventually at a special meeting in March of 2024, trustees directed staff to address the development of a wetland policy in the land use code update. And then following that, at multiple land use code stakeholder meetings, stakeholders recommended addressing that the wetland policy discussion had outside of the land use code update. And so where we are at right now is we would like to provide this board with essentially an update on the project, and then receive some direction on whether or not to develop the local wetland policy in the land use code or outside of land use code, And then we will have Isa talk to us a little bit more about House Bill 1379, which essentially created or will create a state dredge and fill program that kind of mends that gap from the wetlands that were kind of taken out of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers jurisdiction during this last Supreme Court ruling. So with that, do you have anything else you want to add?
No.
Cool. With that, we can hand it over to Isa to provide an update on the wetland mapping project.
Hello, my apologies for being a few minutes late. I misunderstood that we were starting at 7, so but happy to be joining this group tonight. I wish I could be there in person, but grateful for this opportunity to discuss the work that Ironwood has completed over the past year and some of the recent changes that have been implemented at the state level, which might be helpful in guiding the town in a direction in terms of deciding on whether or not to adopt a wetland ordinance or not. I did put together a short PowerPoint presentation, primarily for the benefit of the new trustees, to give an overview of the wetland inventory process. I can share my screen if that works.
Yeah, you should have sharing abilities.
Okay. And I know I had a little trouble with this last time. There's a way to get a PowerPoint and Zoom to work together, so bear with me just one moment here. It's a little easier to do in Teams, but let's see. Somewhere it will allow me to share. There we go.
I love technology.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay? Looks like
Yes,
it.
we can. Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah. So my name is Isa Crum. I'm a wetland ecologist and a permitting specialist with Ironwood Consulting. I'm based in Colorado. I'm a native to Colorado, but have worked through most of the Western United States, specifically dealing with
Hey,
wetland.
Isa, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Your audio is a little weird right now. Once we started sharing the screen, I'm wondering if maybe it's a bandwidth issue and you might want to turn off your camera to save on bandwidth.
I'll try that. How's that? Is that a little better?
The audio is a little garbled. I think it's the audio part, unfortunately.
Okay, let me try rejoining and see if that helps.
Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you clear. Let's see, there's three screens here. Oh, technology.
So that sounded good.
That sounded better?
Yeah.
Lots better.
Okay. Okay. We'll move forward.
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Okay, so in this presentation, and for an overview of the wetland inventory that I performed this past fall, and to discuss a little bit about the changes in Clean Water Act, that's the federal level.
Sorry,
And then-
Isa, it's garbled again.
Geez. Okay. Okay. I don't know if we should have the same slideshow.
What's that?
I mean, if the screen sharing is challenging,
We
we
could try and share your screen from our end, and then you could just tell us, or we could do your presentation from our end, and you could just tell us next, 'cause it seems to be just when you're sharing your screen.
Yeah. We
Ready?
might do that if that works on your end.
We'll try this real quick. Where Lucy's gonna share her screen and walk us through, and maybe we can hear you better.
Okay, and I'm gonna make your screen larger because I can actually see you. I think I could do that. Oh.
There we go.
okay.
We can try this one.
Okay, we'll start from the beginning. And you can actually go ahead and go to the next slide. This is just sort of an overview of, so Ironwood prepared a scope of work in response to the RFP last fall, and that scope of work was quite a bit broader than what we ultimately ended up providing to the town. And I think that was actually a good approach because of still some uncertainty about what direction the town wanted to go in. So we really just focused in on compiling all the existing wetland data and reviewing that, discussing with the town some different options to evaluate the functions or conditions of the wetlands in the town, and then doing the actual wetland mapping and delineation work. So this is just sort of an overview of the two tasks that comprised our scope of work. I updated this based on what we ultimately completed, and that included the data compilation and review and putting together a geodatabase. We did provide some information about our recommendations for functional assessment methodology. We did not ultimately perform functional assessment or condition assessment of wetlands. And then we did the delineation work last fall. And we had initially proposed to capture drone imagery of the town, but we were able to acquire high resolution multispectral imagery from CDOT for a very low cost, which assisted in the reviewing wetland boundaries on private lands. You can go to the next slide. So some of the types of data that we reviewed initially included things like the National Wetland Inventory and the National Hydrography Data Set. These are national data sets. They're derived primarily from aerial imagery analysis, and some of the mapping is quite dated. So it can be a great resource for preliminarily identifying where aquatic resources might be on the landscape, but because there's a lot of limitations, mainly in that they're very outdated. As I mentioned, much of the data isn't field ground truth, and some of the boundaries of some of these features will change dramatically, even within a short period of time. As I mentioned, we also were able to acquire this high resolution imagery from CDOT. And then some of the other data that we reviewed included the parcel boundaries that helped us determine where we could do field investigations. And then we reviewed the Army Corps of Engineer Permit Finder website to identify approved jurisdictional determinations and Section 404 permits that had been issued in the town limits. You could go to the next slide. We also provide a recommendation on a functional or condition assessment should the town decide to implement that at a later time. We recommended using the Ecological Integrity Assessment, or EIA. This is a national assessment protocol or a framework. There's a Colorado version that was developed by the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and it's been implemented to evaluate wetland condition throughout the state. It's a nice methodology because it gets to more than just the functions that wetlands provide, and provides more information about some of the other values and benefits, including values for wildlife and other characteristics. Next slide. I kind of touched on this already. We acquired this imagery from CDOT. It was a much more cost-effective imagery, and ultimately served the purpose that we were hoping that the drone imagery might provide. Next slide. After we did all of our desktop work, we completed field-based delineations last October. We used the Army Corps of Engineers regional supplement to guide our delineation works or delineation work. Wetland determinations or delineation of wetland boundaries are not dependent on federal jurisdiction. So we looked for features on the landscape that met what the Army Corps calls this 3-parameter test, meaning that the wetland supported hydrology indicators, vegetation indicators, and soil indicators. And we collected data onto an Army Corps of Engineer form to support that determination. We also looked for potential surface connections. So one of the changes that was made in 2023, as some of you might be familiar with, was a Supreme Court ruling, also known as Zackett versus EPA, which led to the loss of federal protection over wetlands that used to have what they would call a significant nexus. Under this new, what they call the conforming rule, in order for there to be a federal jurisdiction of a wetland to navigable waters, there has to be this surface connection. So we looked for those types of indicators also while we were out in the field. And then at a later time, we went back and revisited what we had mapped to try to understand what might fall under the state's jurisdiction. And I'll touch on that more at the end. Okay, next slide. Just as a summary, so we mapped roughly 85 acres of wetlands within the town limits, which is roughly 16% of the total land cover in the town. Just to give you some perspective, obviously this is just what is present within the town limits at this time. We did review some historic imagery to try to understand how many of these wetland complexes might have been present at the time that the town was settled. That proved to be a little bit difficult looking at black and white imagery. But it's safe to say that probably a good number of the natural wetlands in the town existed to some extent, even as recent as 100 years ago. Most of the wetlands in the town are supported by a natural water source, primarily groundwater or overbank flooding from an adjacent stream or river. Approximately 5 acres are situated on disturbed sites that might be primarily supported by an artificial water source, which would be overland runoff or stormwater runoff. And then we estimated that up to 8.8 acres of the wetlands that we mapped that were previously covered under the Clean Water Act lost that protection with the second decision. In reviewing the recent legislation, it's likely that most of the wetlands within the town limits will fall under the state's jurisdiction. And again, I'll touch on that a bit more at the end. Okay, next slide. In lieu of preparing a summary report, we instead developed a story map. This is an Esri or ArcGIS based interface that can be publicly shared to provide information regarding the wetland inventory. It's much more aesthetically pleasing than a report and allows you to scroll through and interact with the information, and we were able to provide links in the story map. We've shared this with the town, should you decide to share that publicly at a later date. We also provided the town with a GIS database that contains all the data that we acquired and collected for the inventory. Next slide. So I'm gonna pause there just for a minute in case anyone has any questions about the wetland inventory data collection process. No? Okay. So House Bill 1379 was signed into law on May 30th of this year. And this was after a very, very long process of meeting with various stakeholders and holding lots and lots of meetings, getting input from all the experts and hearing from different industries to try to come to some form of legislation that would work for all of Colorado. It was ultimately signed by Governor Polis on the 30th and ultimately will go into effect on January 1st of next year. The program will be administered by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They will have roughly a year to go through the rulemaking process in order to determine what the permitting fee structure might look like, what compensatory mitigation might look like, in addition to other more substantial details not provided in the text of this bill. So once it goes into effect in January, there'll still be kind of this vague period where they will be requiring potential entities that would be impacting the waters of the state to get a permit without an actual dredge and fill permit program fully built out. So in that interim period from now until January 1st, there is what's called the Clean Water Policy 17. That was all passed by CDPHE 2 years ago, shortly after the second decision. A year ago, after the second decision became formalized. What that program or policy is, it's an enforcement discretion policy, which essentially means that someone that is impacting a wetland that is not under federal jurisdiction should be reaching out to CDPHE to notify them about this potential dredge or fill impact. From there, it's also a little unclear how they have been approving these dredge and fill projects. It's my understanding that they really have only been focusing on larger projects that have substantial impacts on wetlands that lost federal protection. So this has also been called the GAP wetland program. And then, in cases where that impact is substantially large, they could pursue that fill impact as a violation of water quality effects. So that's kind of the landscape that we're in at the moment until this bill goes into effect. That's not tremendously long from now, so it probably doesn't have too much bearing for the town at this time in terms of deciding which pathway to take going forward. But in terms of what we're anticipating the Waters of the State program might look like, initially they had considered this to be more of a gap waters program. So state or permits would only be required for wetlands that previously were protected under the Clean Water Act. Ultimately, they decided to go with a more of a full-scale Waters of the State program. What this means is that most of the wetlands and waters, including those that have never been protected under the Federal Clean Water Act, will be protected under this law. In terms of what that will look like from a permitting perspective, again, it's a little bit of a gray area because we'll have cases where a potential project or activity might require a Section 404 permit and a Waters of the State permit. I think that's part of what will be resolved in the rulemaking process through continuing to communicate and collaborate with the Army Corps of Engineers offices in Colorado. But it is our understanding that the Waters of the State program will very much be mirrored off of the federal Section 404 permit program, which means that there'll be two types of authorizations or permits. One, they're calling an individual authorization, which will be similar to an individual permit. The other being a general authorization, which is going to be similar to nationwide permits. There will be compensatory mitigation requirements. And again, we're assuming that this will follow the Army Corps of Engineer model and be consistent with the Army Corps of Engineer mitigation rule guidance. And that sort of directs this watershed approach as sort of the being at the forefront, meaning that the compensation or mitigation should be located in the same watershed as the impact. It's also possible that they will want to follow this mitigation hierarchy, meaning that they'll give preference to pursuing compensatory mitigation through a mitigation bank or in lieu fee program, as opposed to permittee responsible mitigation. You can go to the next slide. Included in this bill are a whole list of exempted activities. I'm just listing out some of them here. The list is quite a bit more extensive than this, actually. Things to note here, they have identified activities as being exempted if they received a Section 404 permit prior to May 25th, 2023. Similarly, if a project is in receipt of an active, non-expired, approved jurisdictional determination that was issued before May 25th, 2023, they will not require a permit for those activities. The caveat to that is that approved jurisdictional determinations are valid for only a 5-year period. So if that determination has expired, this won't apply. Some of the other types of activities that they have spelled out as being exempt under this program include maintenance of what they're calling currently serviceable structures. So these are typically something like a dike or dam or levee that was constructed likely with under a Clean Water Act permit and might just require, replacement or reapplying riprap or replacing a bridge structure. We would anticipate that those types of activities wouldn't require a new permit. Other things that might be exempted include construction or maintenance of farm ponds, stock ponds, irrigation ditches, drainage ditches, roadside ditches, and canals conveying wastewater or water, and then construction of stormwater or sediment basins on uplands. Next slide. Oops, sorry, next slide. Oh, you're there. Okay. They also identify excluded waters. So these are waters or wetlands that wouldn't require a permit if they were impacted. The most significant of which would include ditches and canals that were excavated or constructed on uplands and convey water or terminate in uplands. This would include a lot of the roadside ditches in the town, if they were constructed for that purpose, or any future sort of stormwater conveyance structures. I would anticipate that those would not fall under state jurisdiction. Other things such as artificial lakes, lagoons, and ponds that were constructed in uplands for watering stock or for irrigation purposes, and artificial waters like swimming pools and ornamental bodies of water. Water-filled depressions that are constructed during a construction project or during mining activities would not be considered waters of the state, with the exception being in cases of a mining activity. Once they've finished that mining activity, that resulting pit or pond could fall under state jurisdiction. Groundwater does not fall into the category of waters of the state for this program. Swales and erosional features that don't have an ordinary high water mark or a formal channel, and prior converted croplands. Next slide. So this is where, again, some of the gray area in this this legislature exists, and it really comes down to timelines and permit fees and mitigation. The only timeline that they've explicitly defined in the bill are for individual authorizations, and they have stated that the division or CDPHE will have 2 years after receiving a complete application to make a permit decision. For general authorizations, so these are your general permits meant to cover a wide range of similar activities. The timeline for review has not been established. I assume that they might follow something similar to what the Army Corps has adopted for nationwide permits, which is 45 days, but I think it will really come down to what sort of staff and capacity they have to process these authorizations, knowing that they're going to have a lot more of them, since there'll be a more encompassing jurisdiction under this bill. Permits wouldn't be required if you're just cutting or removing vegetation in a wetland that is considered waters of the state. The permit fee structure, so we do know that there'll be some sort of fee required for applying for a general or individual authorization. What that will look like is a big unknown. We would assume that they will estimate that sort of based on how the first year goes with the budget that has been approved for the program, and then try to determine, what additional funding is needed to cover the cost of the program. They did identify or define when mitigation would be required for impacts, which is essentially the same as what is required for Army Corps of Engineers, which is 1/10 of an acre of impacts to wetlands and 3,000th of an acre to waters. Next slide. So we put together this map. I think this was included in the agenda packet. And this sort of illustrates what we're assuming waters of the state jurisdiction might look like come January 1st. The caveat to this is that we have this sort of lighter purple category for no that has an asterisk. And those are wetlands that were subject to a previous approved jurisdictional determination. In some cases, most notably the Shrine Hill Wetland Complex, those AJDs really only apply to the portion of the wetland that for which that AJD was issued, so not the entire complex. But we didn't delineate the wetland by parcel boundary. So, and it's possible, and again, this is kind of an unknown, it's possible that a landowner could say, well, you know, so-and-so has this valid AJD, which found that this wetland complex was not under federal jurisdiction, and they could try to use that to demonstrate that their activity is exempt from needing a permit. Those two active AJDs that are associated with the Shrine Hill wetland will expire in 2027, I believe. So after that time, that area would be considered waters of the state. And similarly, for the wetland complex that is sort of in the center of town, which has an active AJD, once that has expired, it would be considered a waters of the state unless that landowner were to move forward prior to that with their development. The only areas that we have identified as not falling under waters of the state jurisdiction based on our reading of the bill language would include roadside ditches, essentially. So that's sort of all I've pulled together for a presentation. I did just want to say that some of the things that the town might want to consider just going forward really just relate to some of the uncertainties that are still in play with this new legislation. There's likely going to be some pushback from different industries once this rolls out, including from the development industry. The other thing to note is that, of course, these permits really are limited to impacts to areas that have been mapped as a water or wetland. It doesn't include impacts to adjacent areas, including riparian corridors or wetland setback areas or buffer areas. Some of the other wetland ordinances that are currently being implemented in Colorado are really mostly specific to protecting or requiring some sort of permit action for projects that impact that wetland setback or buffer area, or similarly for impacts to riparian corridors. And that's just recognizing that there are still pretty significant water quality effects in addition to ecological effects that can occur from those types of impacts. So that's kind of all I have. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Isa. I'm going to open it up to the trustees. I think since there are a lot of new faces here, just open it up since we have Isa online, and that was a lot of information. Jim and I here, we've learned a lot about wetlands over the last couple of years. So opening it up to trustee questions, and I realize we have some public in the audience and online, so we'll try to preserve some time for comments at the end if we can. I know there's been a lot of community engagement around this. I think what's really helpful is to get the information presented to us, have the trustee discussion, and try to open it up for comment. So any questions?
Thank you for that presentation. I do have one question, and correct me if you said this in the presentation, but the 8.8 acres that we lost in the second ruling, that will be covered now with the new House bill. Is that correct?
That's correct. Except again, the Shrine Hill Wetland Complex, actually, I'll back up. That was actually not considered a waters of the US even pre-second. So I believe that all of the wetlands that lost that protection were not currently subject to an approved jurisdictional determination. So yes, all of those wetlands would be considered waters of the state and would be covered under this legislation.
I know you guys have questions. Go.
I actually, yeah, this all tracks. I did a lot of learning on wetlands too, so I don't know.
Isa, I did have a clarifying question. I had a clarifying question. I really appreciated the map that kind of was updated based off of the state legislation. So going back to the Shrine Hill complex that's in that lighter purple. So from what I understand is because there's some active jurisdictional determinations on certain property owners' parcels, that status affects adjoining parcels, or it's kind of a question mark. Like, again, if someone was, farther down in this area on the map and they wanted to submit a land use application and they're not part of that jurisdictional determination that's currently pulled, what does that mean for them when they think about the state regulations? And what does it mean for the town? Yeah.
Yeah, and again, this is all kind of assuming because I'm not CDPHE and they have a huge hill to climb ahead of them. But if it were the Army Corps of Engineers, the way that they would approach this, and again, assuming that they were in a landscape where the federal regulations changed such that the way that waters of the US were being defined would mean that something that was found to be non-jurisdictional would now be jurisdictional. They would only honor the approved jurisdictional determination for that area that was covered, but it would not apply to adjacent areas, even if it was the same wetland complex. That's just my understanding of how that's been approached at the federal level. I would assume that would track similarly at the state level. But I could just see that being an area where they might get some pushback. And given that this is a new program, they're going to have very limited funding. If someone were to try to bring about some sort of lawsuit, they might not push back. But again, this is all just kind of assuming different scenarios that could be at play.
Yeah, thanks. So if those jurisdictional determinations did not exist on the map, would your understanding be that because of the characteristics and definition of wetlands and waters of the state, this area would be, the state regulations would apply to this area?
Yes.
Yeah.
It would meet the definitions of waters of the state and would not be an exempted category of wetlands under the bill.
Yeah, thanks. The thing that muddies the water is that you also have federal determinations happening as well.
Right. Exactly.
No pun intended there.
Yeah. There's a lot of muddy water.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Any other questions, clarifying comments?
And those determinations will be worked out in the rulemaking process, the end of next year.
Possibly that could be. So the rulemaking process, and one of the benefits of this bill, at least in my opinion, that is really lacking in the Clean Water Act statute. The Clean Water Act doesn't really define what waters of the US is. That was all done through rulemaking and regulation, which is why it's been such a roller coaster ride. Because it's not a law, it can change. The way that this bill is written, this is a law, so they've tried to include as much detail as possible. That means that there's not going to be a lot of this fluctuation. Once this has been passed, this is what the statute says is the waters of the state, and it charges CDPHE with administering this program. They've laid out exemptions. They tried to capture as much as they possibly could, but there's still going to be some vagueness. So they will have to go through this rulemaking process to try to make up for those deficiencies or questions that will probably come to light during this first year as this program is being rolled out.
Super helpful. Question with the making process. If a landowner submitted a land use application come January 1st and they had wetlands according to the definition that's in our code and also that the state defines, then they would fall under the state's statute, even during this rulemaking process.
Correct.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so it's we're almost end of August. We have September, October, November, December, where it will still kind of be this in between phase where this Clean Water Policy 17 is still in place, but that is not going to cover some of the proposals that you're currently evaluating that are on waters that don't have protection under that policy, but will have protection under the state program.
Yeah. Any other questions from trustees before we have a conversation? Oh, okay. We got a map. Yeah, we got a map. Issa, thanks for your time. I think we'll have a bit of a conversation. I mean, you're welcome to stay on. If anybody has more questions or if you need to jump off, I know you didn't expect to be presenting at this time of day. But I think the trustees can have a conversation, but if there's no other questions for Issa. Does staff feel comfortable if we deliberate, or would you prefer Issa to stay on? Either way.
Really up to you all.
Well, whatever you feel like, Issa.
I'm prepared for whatever. I had blocked off 2 hours. I just blocked off the wrong 2 hours.
Right, that's great. Okay, well, I think we can have a discussion, you know, for those that are new, I know you guys know about this issue, you've been paying attention to it. You're on the town board now. And, you know, when we were originally thinking about this, we just really realized that there were such gaps between maybe what some intentions were in the community and what our options were in our code. And that's what kind of kicked it all off. We got a lot more educated, had a lot of conversations around it. I think it's been really helpful to have this map and be able to talk about what we're actually talking about, right? I would defend that investment of what we have here. I think it gave us kind of some common framework, some common language that was backed by science and data and resources and definitions. I think what's really interesting is that basically, like, while I think the state level approach is often not nuanced enough for municipalities, I bet if we would have workshopped this enough, we probably would have come out with something that's a really good, quote unquote, perfect fit for Silverton. I think it is pretty interesting that we have state regulations that get pretty close to what we were already looking at. I mean, the way they define waters of the US, you know, originally I had been kind of following this dialogue and process and thinking that it was just going to be what had lost protections pre-Sackett. And clearly here now we have a much more robust definition of waters of the state. And so depending on your opinion in town, I think this state level regulation is kind of pretty close to what we were talking about and how we would have modeled something at a municipal level. So I think that's kind of what we have to work with. So I'd kind of put it out to the board. Is anyone really wanting to argue that the town should add something on top of this, that we're missing something? That we have significant concerns that the definitions we have from the state are not covering enough of what we need to be covering, and that the cost of implementing something at the municipal level is worth it. As opposed to kind of having the less nuanced regulations that still might get us pretty close. So any perspectives, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this House bill's new. It's coming up in January. We do have those few months of gray areas. But I almost lean towards, doing at the state level, seeing how that plays out. If we need to make more edits, if we need to go more stringent, then we can as a municipality. But right now, I just don't think it's worth at the moment until it's enacted and we see what's going on with that.
I'm not arguing to be more stringent or not, just, we can't like go back, like we can't make it more stringent.
We can't do less regulation than what the state has.
No, well, but like, if we wanted to go less stringent in 2 years after the rulemaking has happened, there could potentially be already developments on like said wetlands, and then it's like, you can't take that one back.
Right.
So it would either be like a kind of now or not situation, and we can't go less, obviously.
Right. But saying if the town, there's an intention to be more stringent than what's presented in this House bill, it could behoove you to do that sooner rather than later.
Correct.
Yeah.
I tend to agree with Amy. But let's go with the House bill, see how that works for us, and if we need to make adjustments, we can do that at a later date.
I feel pretty, I don't know if content is the right word. I'm not, overjoyed with the verbiage of everything, because I think that we could always use more detail. And the reality of the process of legislating and rulemaking is that the state is only ever going to get, 90% of the way there for things like this. The little bits of nuance will sometimes be lost. And I think we have to accept that. And I feel, content that the definition now is very clear. And I think that in tandem with this work that we have with these maps makes it pretty easy to communicate to people. And I think that's a big win. And I agree. I don't think that additional rulemaking on our part is necessary at this moment.
Also, the last 10% details for the rulemaking process,
Right.
which like seems arduous, but they are really helpful in figuring out that last 10% as you actually have real public comment opportunities. It feels funny, so it's like now I'm on the other side of the table and it's like, oh, it's only a few lots that all of this has been over. So it's definitely interesting. I'm glad we have the map and a delineation now. This is clearer. And I really do appreciate the ArcGIS map. I think that's interesting and helpful for those who are looking at what lot to buy. So particularly helpful.
I feel like with this, there's a bit of it where the state is kind of taking it out of our hands. I mean, obviously, the town can always apply more stringent applications. But I think in some extent, I've talked to so many community members on all sides of this issue over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now. And I think what's interesting is this is sort of like the compromise. It's not the town regulating people's property rights. It's really at the state level. And we're going to have a lot of property owners tied up in this regulatory approach, for better or for worse. And what I do think that this state bill offers the community is to chance to have those dialogues around actual land. And I think it allows any advocacy groups in town, conservation groups that really are interested in preserving certain places, because even the state's rules, they don't necessarily say this won't be developed. They just say there'll be mitigation procedures, right? It's following very much what already happens at the Army Corps level. I think it creates options where folks that own these parcels know that their land is now regulated by the state. That's a certain process. And it might open up more conversations for landowners and conservation groups to talk about conservation easements and tax credits and a variety of things that could actually have a more positive outcome for some of this land outside of this table deciding what happens to that land. And so I kind of see that as a win. And it doesn't necessarily pit neighbor against neighbor, it pits people against the state. You can go complain with the state because really, there's not a lot we can do about what they're doing at that level. So I just think this opens up some potential conversations on the private side for options around land use.
The rulemaking process, I know that it sounds like arduous and annoying, but having been involved in rulemaking processes, they really do look at the comments. So developers, folks who own property, I encourage participation in the rulemaking process.
Yeah.
So it does really matter.
Yeah. Thanks, Lindsay. I think we also had concerns from some of our advocacy minded community members of kind of the speed, right? That we would irrevocably lose certain areas that were really important. And I think again, this stuff is very time consuming and procedural. And so I think that we now have something at the state level that, as Jim said often during those conversations, potentially pumps the brakes. Because I think any landowner that is thinking about development is now part of this process. And so I think that tends to create a little bit of caution on the part of some landowners who might be looking into developing. I think we don't quite have the same urgency and crisis that maybe we felt before, because now the situation is more part of the process of lawmaking and regulation. So yeah, Jim, thoughts? Anybody else?
No, I think this is terrific. I think this is what we've been waiting for. This is that defining map, the moment that we've taken 2 years to get here. And this information is what will help us. This will give us the tools, the community, and each and every one of us the tools to move forward and truly define what is what. So yeah, I'm happy with this. I'm very happy with this, actually.
Thanks.
So.
I have a question for staff. So I'm hearing, unless trustees want to speak up differently, that there's a general consensus that the state's regulatory approach feels sufficient. Does anyone feel strongly that that is not the case? Okay. And we're missing Tyler here, but we'll loop him into the fold. So I'm hearing the sense that we think the state's regulations are sufficient. From a procedural standpoint, from a staff perspective with land use applications and or the land use code. Currently, there's a section in the land use code on environmentally sensitive areas. It has a heading called wetlands. So if the direction is moving towards relying on the state's regulatory approach for any lots that would be affected, what would be staff's thought on what that language would be in that section? Or would it really, period, question mark.
Take out that section.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then
It's very rare that we would put in there, see state regulations for something.
Yeah.
We would just omit that section and have that knowledge when we do our pre-application meetings to tell them where to go. The map is helpful in that respect, where we can kind of gauge and be like, oh, you're kind of close. You should probably contact the state on this one. So it does give staff a very useful tool.
Yeah. So this would be handled less at the code level because we wouldn't have our own municipal ordinance, and more at the process level with the application process. Yeah.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's very similar to, the federal process where this is a conversation that the landowner needs to have with the US Army Corps of Engineers they would need to have this conversation with the state rather than the town.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, thanks.
And then just to reiterate, this is the baseline. And if the town wants to do more, we could later on.
Can get more stringent.
Yep. You need the baseline.
You need the baseline
baseline.
and the map.
Yep.
We got the map.
Been waiting a long
I,
time for this.
Can I just respond to that? Yeah, just, it's very, I mean, I think it's gonna be very hard to increase the baseline, right? Like to go more stringent once the baseline is set. After seeing this process, I get concerned about that approach a little bit. And so if there is an indication that we do want to be more stringent, that is something to probably be considered sooner rather than later.
Mhm.
So once the state sets their regulations, it'll be very hard to figure out what we would want to change or adapt after. Like, what is this, like a term is like policy process, and it's like, once a policy is set, it's like very hard to change that policy. And that will probably be true for this.
Yeah.
But for the whole thing all over again.
I think from my perspective, when I look at the House bill, it just strikes me as very close to what we were getting with our ordinance to begin with. And so I'm just going to argue personally that we've spent a lot of staff time. We've spent a lot of town time. And now we have this option from the state. And I would argue for using what we have, potentially, as opposed to directing staff to do a little bit more research on whether we want to go deeper. I think they might kill us. And so again, it's totally fine if there's disagreement, but I'd like to hear really strong advocacy for that. Because again, I think what we have here is a pretty good enough approach, and I would have to really be convinced why we need to dedicate additional staff time and town resources towards going further. I liked your word, Carl, content. It's not perfect. It might be a little blunt. But I'm open to strong arguments otherwise, considering Lindsay's point.
And I'm not sure that the board does. I just want to make it clear to the public, like if there was a time to say you want something more stringent, is it? Yeah. Now we got a map.
Well, maybe to that point, I can't tell. I think we might have commenting on Zoom, and we also have a participant in the audience. So I would be welcome to open it up to public comment. We'll structure it like our normal public comment. If you'd like to make a comment, you're welcome to. You have 3 minutes. And we'll do it in person first, or if you're just here listening. I'll comment.
I'm Evan Harris. I live in town. I'm super glad that there is now a bill. The gray area obviously scares me because it gives me PTSD from 2 years ago with having gray area. But it does sound like even if applications went in, then still some of that land would be under those regulations. So that's all.
And
Thank you.
And you've been a part of this since day one, so thank you.
thank you
you.
for being here.
Come
Evan.
on.
All right, we have one more on Zoom. We will promote you to panelists. Thank you, Melody. You have 3 minutes. The floor is yours.
I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yes.
I just wanted to remind you that before today, when you have the information that the state's going to do, that the town attorney told you that if you did something to cause someone's wetlands to be unusable, that would be something you would have to purchase. I don't have his wording exactly, but it would be called a takings. So keep that in mind. If you decide to go more stringent, talk to the attorney. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gloria. Or thank you, Melody. All right, well, I think we have our public comment. We had some good conversations. Isa, if you're still there, I'm going to put you on the spot. If you're not, that's fine too. But just question for you based on our deliberations. Did you have any clarification you wanted to add or any follow-up?
No, you did raise a good point that, again, this is a permitting program. It is not meant to we call it a protection program, and ultimately the goal is a no net loss of aquatic resources. There will always be some loss associated with that temporary, or they call it a temporal loss of a water resource, and attempting to mitigate within the same watershed, there's always going to be some impact to water quality. So just wanted to make it clear that this program it's a dredge and fill authorization program intending to preserve the acreage of wetlands and waters within the state.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Well, we appreciate the insight and the data that you provided. I think it's been a really helpful tool for us to have this conversation. So thank you to Ironwood for the quality of the product we have here. Any other questions from the board before we have a break?
Oh, man.
I just have one comment while we're on the subject. I think that the ArcGIS story map is excellent. And I think that's a resource that we should definitely, push out to the community as much as we can, as a way to learn about this process and what the new legislation means and where the wetlands in Silverton are. So kudos to the Ironwood team for putting together a really, really excellent resource.
Thank you. I'll pass that along to our GIS team.
Who's posting on Facebook?
Met it.
Thank you for this opportunity, and
Thank you, Issa. We appreciate it.
Should we do one thing I talked about the border tree, which I was remembering a little bit ago, is like a retrospective of seems like we're coming close to the end of this process. What do we want to do? What went well? What would we change? What could we do different as a 5-minute learning moment?
Yeah, you mean right now?
Yeah, right now. We have time, right?
Yeah.
So now that we're all here.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful.
Is that okay?
What did we learn? What would we do? Just kidding. Well, and I did want to put out to the community as well. Again, this almost sort of feels, I don't know, Evan, if you feel it sort of feels anticlimactic, considering all the conversations we've had about this, and where we last left this was really putting this out to the community in the land use code. And then I think it's oh, well, the state just said this is what's required, and this is kind of what we would have written. So great. So I just think putting it back out there to the community, I appreciate all the engagement on this. And again, if you want to learn more, if you want to know what the effects are, I think the presentation in the packet is super helpful. It's very clear. The map, it's very clear.
Publish that story map on our website, like a link to it.
Yeah.
That the public can, and we'll do that right on our front page so that people can find it really easily.
That's great. And I think the takeaways being, it's important to have those bullet points, which are, the pre and post Sackett decision affected what the Army Corps regulates. And now the state has come up with their own set of regulations that basically applies to, the points that Issa made in here, applies to the vast majority, if not all, of the areas that are defined as wetlands on the map. And so I think helping people just understand that narrative. Helpful. So, okay, what did we learn?
So what I like to do is what went well, what will we improve on, and what will we change for next time, right? So I think what went well was almost you want to say Delta, but anyway, what went well, I think the map is great. The old board commissioning the map is an important step because I don't think anyone would have gotten here without that. So appreciate the old board for doing that.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from you guys too. You have.
Tyler.
I'll go next. The one thing I've said throughout this entire 2-year process, you can quote me on this, is allow the process to work. And it may not move at the pace we want. We may not all get the outcome that we desire, but just simply allow the process to work. And that's it. And look where we are now from that meeting several months back. And regardless of the outcome, the process worked. It worked well. It's your government for you.
Local and state.
Right.
Yeah.
Working for you.
I think for me, a really great reflection was both with the previous board. I mean, most of this was discussed within the previous board, and I think what was so significant is that even when there was disagreement on the board, there was a lot of respect and civility. And even in the community, we had meetings where we had people on very opposite sides of this issue that were respectful to each other. There was no chair throwing. We didn't have to call the sheriff. There was no violence, which has not always been the case. And so I think having that tone where we could hash it out and disagree with a measure of civility and respect was something I just hope we can always continue, and something I really want to call out. And I think staff was also very professional throughout all of it.
And patient.
And patient. And so I think those things went really well. That's all positive stuff.
It's very
Didn't
positive.
go-
No,
Would you,
very positive.
would you improve upon?
I think the tricky part in a situation like this is you don't know what you don't know.
Mhm.
Right? When we were sitting here with an individual land use application that had been multiple years in the process, and we were all like, at that point, right, the applicant didn't know what they didn't know, the board didn't know what they didn't know, the community didn't know what they didn't know. And that's challenging. I'm not sure there's always a way to fix that. But that's what stood out to me is that I don't know if you guys feel this on the staff level. It took a long time to sort of figure out what are we actually talking about here?
Mhm.
And that's why I think to your point, Lindsay, the map was really helpful. It tamped down the narrative of what are we actually talking about, but.
And creating those definitions that we were looking for the whole time. What is what? And this is, and this process worked. It worked.
I think paying attention to those blind spots of what you might not know. And working through community back and forth. I mean, talking to a lot of people on both a variety of perspectives. And so what would we do differently? Staff, do you guys have any thoughts?
I mean, being reflective, I've definitely learned a lot from this one issue. And one thing I think we could have done in the beginning a little better is refine our process. So I think we were trying to figure out our process in the beginning. And I think refining that before we started moving forward would have been better. So outlining with you all, okay, this is our agreed upon process moving forward. And that is something I've learned from with this whole issue is on day one, let's start with a really contentious issue and outline that process from the beginning so that we're not totally discovering it on our way through.
I think it has a lot to do with prioritization. I mean, we're going to talk about that later in our meeting as well, about how we prioritize funding and staff time. And anytime we tell staff to do something, that's a prioritization, right? That's a direction saying, this is important, you need to work on this. And I think all of us being cognizant of that, and so having procedural mechanisms to say and check in, okay, there's a lot of talk about this issue, there's a lot of conversation, there's buzz, there's maybe a small group that's really loud, or there's a lot of people talking a lot, we don't know, but having good ways of prioritizing our time, staff's time, and the community's time, I think is something we could work better. That's my perspective.
Gloria, do you feel like you have a good indication of like when those sticky issues are gonna come and we're like, okay, what's our process here? Like,
Honestly, they blindside me sometimes.
But I think that's what's so good about this process is we did not have those mechanisms in place. We didn't have that point by point of how we were going to do it, how we were going to address it. And we actually navigated the waters pretty well.
Oh, planning.
See?
everyone has to do one. That's the new rule.
And what was really good was the previous board and this board being flexible in sometimes going rogue and allowing that public comment and having the town come in. I'm looking at you, you're one of them, and have those educated discussions and ease the minds of people that may not actually have all the facts, because we were gathering the facts at the same time. But having that dialogue and having that information process, I think we learned a lot from this. And I think the town did as well. This was a win all the way around. And this was a good thing.
Anybody else from the outside watching the initial phase of this? Things we could have done better. I mean, really, no, seriously, honestly, I think it's an important discussion.
I mean, I agree with Jim. I do think it took that one application to get to where we are now. Because we might not really be discussing it. And also just a shout out to the different checks and balances in government where the federal government made the second ruling and we're just like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about that? And we're going through this process and the state came and kind of had our backs and made this new House bill. And then at a local jurisdiction, we can even check them and make things more stringent to or shape it to our community. So I just think that's really special.
I think that the way that sort of the public utilities stuff is going is like a proof point of there has been like a lot learned in this process. Cause I feel really guided through that. And I think we're getting a lot of public input and it's like, it's kind of working now. And we're able to like move through that sticky situation a little bit easier, at least now coming into it, having watched what happened and not seeing that in a similar way with like potentially raising, utility rates.
It's creating the roadmap for future boards. That's what we're doing. It's that manual that we're gonna hand to the next board as we leave, and they're gonna benefit from everything that we've gone through. It's a good.
And shout out to the community for being in on this discussion, for being engaged, for showing up. A lot of cold late night meetings. And again, that level of civility and respectfulness, I think, was super important for helping to kind of change the way we all engage with each other. We're not all going to get along. We're kind of like, big old step family. But I think being able to have those conversations and feel like people had the ability to come and share and not feel disparaged or whatever, and that the board could hear and also kind of have a thoughtful conversation. So thanks to the community for showing up. Don't stop showing up.
Yeah, engage. You want everyone to engage.
Any other last thoughts? Lessons learned?
Do you feel like, it's anticlimactic? You feeling good? Close the book on it?
I told my sons this when I was leaving. I said, well, today we're going to be talking about wetlands. He's like, wetlands? You're always talking about wetlands. Wetlands. Like, no. So they were taken aback. I was so happy. I said, well, they said, well, I thought you like fixed that. I said, well, nothing's ever quite fixed. It's an iterative process.
A very iterative process.
All right. Does staff have any other questions? Clear direction?
I think we have our clear direction. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great. All right. It is 6:22. We'll adjourn the work session and we will go on to the town board meeting at 7 o'clock.